Sugar white sand, coastal dune lakes that occasionally tear themselves open and drain straight into the Gulf, and a resort corridor built over centuries of shipwrecks, mound-building chiefdoms, and Civil War deserters. This is Florida's 30A, and this is the rise, the limit. Welcome to Chapter 1, From Forts to Floodgates on 30A, the opening chapter, where a return visit to Blue Mountain Beach becomes something else entirely once the traveler starts reading what the landscape is actually saying. The chapter moves from the geology underfoot, quartz carried down from the Appalachians and lakes pinned in place by late-Holocene sands, through indigenous platform mounds, a hurricane-ruined Spanish colony, and seaside's suspiciously photogenic streets, before a rainstorm forces open a lake outfall mid-family walk and makes the whole argument in about 30 seconds. Strap in, because the water here has always decided where people go. The theater of Transience is open for business along Florida's Scenic Highway 30A. I have made the pilgrimage to this specific ribbon of coastline more times than I care to catalogue, driving 4 to 7 hour shots from former lives in Knoxville, Atlanta, and Chattanooga. The destination I once knew has been paved over. Not with asphalt, but with people. Since the plague-driven exodus from the cities, what was once a quiet Thanksgiving retreat has mutated into a year-round gladiatorial combat for parking spaces and condo reservations. We usually make camp in Blue Mountain Beach, a corner of the coast that has not quite received the full gilding of its neighbors at Seaside or Alice Beach, though the developers are certainly trying. It always felt a little more real, a little lower key, and naturally that is precisely what is missing now. The entire coast has been polished to a high sheen. It is a place where the air itself seems curated by a committee, offering a highly probable blend of salt spray, expensive sunscreen, and the faint sweet scent of saw palmetto baking in the sun. Like all of our little expeditions, we make no pretense of being authoritative. I can promise this version of the story is actual, or at least as actual as my memory allows. The ambient sound here is the whisper of bicycle chains on pavement, punctuated by the sharp slam of a screen door on a $10,000 a week rental. It is a landscape of master-planned towns where every porch column conforms to a strict aesthetic code. It is a sun-drenched economy built on the premise of a flawless week. You might think this curated vision is the whole story, if you believe history is something that happens only to other people in textbooks. But this environment is merely the latest, thinnest layer of ink on a document that has been written on, scraped clean, and written on again for centuries. The sugar-white quartz of the beach is an optical illusion that blinds the eye to provenance. Washed down from the southern Appalachians by panhandle rivers and sorted by rising seas, these ancient sands create a landscape that feels suspended in a perpetual, sun-bleached present. To the casual repeat visitor, this coast is a corridor of leisure. It is a string of rare coastal dune lakes and pastel new urbanist towns that served as the set for the Truman Show. It is the polished perfection of a high-end resort economy, a place where nature has been tamed, manicured, and basically taught to fetch a margarita. The Polish is a veneer. To walk the Timpucci Trail or drive the canopy roads of Walton County is to move across a surface tension that barely holds back a deeper, wilder reality. This journey begins with a return to Blue Mountain Beach to seek the familiar rhythms of an annual vacation, but it inevitably pivots into an excavation of the layers beneath. The resort strip is not a blank slate. Instead, it is a palimpsest of movement, coercion, and reinvention. The same topography that now dictates building codes and beach access once directed the desperation of Spanish conquistadors. In the year 1528, the Grand Pánfilo de Narváez came upon these shores. He arrived searching specifically for gold and glory rather than a good brunch spot. He found neither. Instead, he encountered a great pestilence of mosquitoes and a humid stagnation that lay upon the spirit like a wet wool blanket. His expedition, much like a poorly planned family reunion, dissolved into bickering, starvation, and a desperate consumption of their own horses. Those who followed in the wake of Tristan de Luna fared no better against the late summer storms. Their mighty galleons were reduced to kindling by the Gulf's violent winds, leaving them to ponder why the Chamber of Commerce had not warned them of hurricane season. The narrative thread pulls from these tangled roots of the mangroves and the seabed. It stretches from the doomed navigation of Narváez and the hurricane-wrecked colony of Luna to the cross-cultural diplomacy of the Yuchi leader Timpucci Kinnard and the Unionist raids of General Alexander Asboth. Here the past is not merely a prologue, it is a geologic force. This force plausibly survives in the hydrology of the Dune Lakes that violently breach into the Gulf after heavy rains, converting calm water into torrents that challenge the safety of a modern condo stay. It survives in the predatory shadows of bull sharks patrolling the mixing zones and in the bones of the Veneer wreck resting in the shallows. From the erratic wanderings of Cabeza de Vaca to the precise architectural codes of Seaside, the story of 30A is a continuum of human attempts to impose order on a shifting, storm-prone edge of the continent. While the new urbanist towns attempt to script a perfect reality, the ecological fragility of the Holocene continues to shape how we settle, move, and remember. We build our castles of leisure on these tiny grains of quartz, fully reliant on an illusion of permanence, while standing on the edge of a continent that is constantly trying to wash them away. Squeaky Sands, a geologic journey to emerald shores. This collective illusion of permanence starts at the geologic beginning. The unique character of 30A relies entirely on its shifting, granular foundation. This is not standard abrasive dirt. It is the celebrity of sands, the blindingly white quartz that actually squeaks when you walk on it. The noise sounds less like a natural phenomenon and more like a million tiny, well-rounded grains of glass complaining in perfect unison under the weight of a beach cooler. This sugar-white sediment began its journey hundreds of miles away and countless years ago in the southern Appalachians. The source was a lineup of tough, quartz-rich rocks like granite and quartzite. Over millennia, as those mountains weathered, a great geological sorting began. Lesser minerals like feldspar and mica, lacking the constitution for a long transit, simply broke down into clay. The quartz was stubborn and durable. It held on until it was physically released from its rocky prison, ready for a transit that makes a modern holiday road trip look like a short walk down the driveway. Liberation from a mountain requires a dedicated multi-state transportation system, or rather a continental conveyor belt powered entirely by gravity and rain. The primary couriers for this cargo were the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint rivers, along with neighbors like the Choctawhatchee. For eons, they hauled these quartz chunks south in a relentless one-way sediment train to the sea. The mechanism is surprisingly picky. Sediment from the ridges around my former outposts in Chattanooga, for instance, is summarily rejected. It gets funneled into the Tennessee River and told to go bother the Mississippi Delta. The Florida Panhandle runs a strict quartz-only operation. Like any bulk delivery, the merchandise arrives a bit messy at the coast. It requires a final obsessive round of quality control courtesy of the Gulf of Mexico. The waves and wind act as a giant, patient sieve, endlessly bouncing the grains around into an acceptable order. The clean, durable quartz stays on the main beach. Darker, heavier minerals are unceremoniously shoved aside into the thin, black streaks a visitor might notice after a summer storm, visible proof that the sorting system remains online. This entire operation went into overdrive around 21,000 years ago during the last ice age. a period that assigns high confidence to the notion that sea levels are inherently volatile. With the Gulf resting 400 feet lower than it sits today, the coastline sat miles farther out, creating a massive stockpile of Appalachian sand on the exposed continental shelf. As the glaciers melted and the seas rose, the incoming waves pushed that vast sand inventory landward to create the dunes and beaches we occupy today. This perfectly bleached foundation dictates the exact geometry of the local ecosystem. The low, rolling mounds built from this quartz act as a barrier. They trap incoming rainwater and ground seepage, setting the stage for the region's famously rare coastal dune lakes. Even the main attraction, the emerald water, relies entirely on this quartz runoff. That startling local color comes from sunlight reflecting off tiny algae, its brilliance fiercely amplified by the bright white sandy bottom beaming up from below. The sand shapes the dunes, but it is those volatile lakes, pooling right on the edge of the saltwater, that truly complicate the beachfront real estate. Dune Lake dynamos, Florida's shifting coastal gems. The same squeaky clean sand that builds those dunes acts as an exclusive velvet rope, separating the Gulf of Mexico from the coastal lakes. This phenomenon is extraordinarily rare. This 26-mile stretch of Florida coastline joins the ranks of Madagascar, New Zealand, and parts of Australia as one of the few places on Earth to host them. Walton County boasts a cluster of 15. This density makes the region a global hotspot for these peculiar bodies of water, a Silicon Valley for geologically indecisive ponds. These lakes are not grand spectacles. They are typically shallow, wind-sculpted basins fed by rain and groundwater, pooling in Holocene-era quartz sand-like puddles in a sandbox built for giants. Their true ecological fame lies in a dramatic, recurring act of self-sabotage. A meager sand berm divides the freshwater from the Gulf, and the lakes periodically and violently erase that boundary. This clinical process, known as an outfall, forms the central drama of their existence. Heavy rains cause the lake water to rise, building pressure until it bursts through the berm, cutting a temporary river to the sea in a rush of liquid freedom. This breach is a moment of catastrophic failure for any self-respecting container, yet it generates the unique power of the lake. It allows the basin to breathe. It exhales its own water and inhales a large dose of salty Gulf brine on the next tide. This intermittent connection flushes the system, shuffles nutrients, and creates a brackish, dynamic habitat that constantly reinvents itself. Once the water level drops, the tide and wind gently patch the wound. They seal the berm until the pressure builds for the next performance. The outfall is a devastating flood that becomes the engine of renewal, much like a failed politician whose spectacular public disgrace somehow qualifies them for a primetime cable news show. The visual signature of this event is unmistakable. When an outfall occurs, a dark, tea-colored plume of water pours across the bleached beach. Tannins from decomposing leaves and roots in the lakebed produce this dark stain. The result is a surrealist painting brought to life. A winding river of what looks like oversteeped Lipton flows through pristine sand to meet the emerald surf. Western Lake near Grayton Beach provides the classic postcard image of this beautiful mess. It sends resort photographers into a frenzy while reminding anglers and birders that each basin becomes a completely different aquatic environment after a storm. Tourists were obviously not the first to figure out this was a reliable place to find food and water. This constantly remaking landscape has been a hub for human settlement for thousands of years. The archaeology around the Dune Lakes is dense. Not far from the modern highway corridor on the shores of Choctawhatchee Bay, the 4-mile point site once supported a major settlement of the Fort Walton culture. Coastal sites from the Archaic period show that communities adapted to these shifting estuaries long before European explorers mapped the coast. Walking along the manicured paths today, past the rental cottages and boutique coffee shops, you trace routes paved over a landscape where mound-building societies organized their world around the exact same cycles of water and sand. The ground beneath the Timpucci Trail rests on Appalachian quartz, but it also carries the faint, resilient echo of people who mastered this shifting terrain long before it hosted a scenic highway. Blue Mountain Blues, a family's coastal torrent triumph. The ancient engineers of the Fort Walton culture clearly understood the volatile hydrology of this coast, but my family did not. Somehow, knowing these coastal dune lakes are a late-Holocene phenomenon offers surprisingly little comfort when one of them decides to aggressively rearrange the landscape. In our family chat, we refer to these periodic breaches not as the biologically accurate outfalls, but as a shore sneeze, a sudden, violent, and messy expulsion of lake water into the Gulf. My preferred base of operations has always been the vicinity of Blue Mountain Beach, and I recall one expedition where my mother and a detachment of relatives were ambushed by Geology. They had marched out for a walk beyond Redfish Lake. With the fanfare of a minor biblical plague, the lake opened up. The sand berm separating the basin from the Gulf vanished. The placid sheet of water immediately became a raging river. My brother-in-law had to carry my mother out into the ocean. He waded her through the surf and back to the dry side of the beach before they could return the long way to the condo. This sort of localized calamity is a known variable, a fact observed by state planners who decided to thread the paved Timpucci Trail directly alongside these globally rare water bodies anyway. The path dutifully skirts and crosses the basins, offering cyclists unobstructed views of places like Western Lake. Conservation designations followed the pavement, and Deer Lake State Park now anchors the landscape as an untouched museum piece of an original dune lake, preserved right next to the modern developments it naturally predates. Showcasing nature's plumbing comes with certain physical liabilities. The natural breach zones that create those striking outfalls are the exact same pathways that concentrated the damage from Hurricane Opal in 1995. The storm surge simply found its easiest way inland through the carved sand. Before they act as flood channels, these lakes operate as functioning habitats. The periodic flushing creates a brackish soup that attracts a dense roster of wildlife. Bald eagles sweep over the water like airborne security guards looking for exposed fish. The outfalls themselves become dynamic feeding zones. The chaotic collision of freshwater tannins and saltwater creates a murky buffet prized by apex predators, and this is where the biological reality deviates from the sunny travel brochure. The dark water is a documented haunt of bull sharks. Unlike most of their cartilaginous relatives, bull sharks possess a specialized physiological tolerance for swimming in mostly fresh water, an evolutionary loophole that feels deeply unfair to casual swimmers, and there are confirmed sightings of them cruising well inside the dune lakes. As I watch a paddleboarder glide serenely across the surface, a highly specific thought surfaces. She is pausing for a photograph in what is, for all intents and purposes, a shark cafeteria. Does the short-term rental agreement mention that? The immediate surroundings of my own coastal routine, Big Redfish Lake and Little Redfish Lake, sit pooled between the upland pines and the Gulf. The names are not some creative liberty taken by a real estate developer. Locals historically pulled heavy redfish from these exact waters, a direct biological result of those periodic connections to the sea. Big Redfish covers roughly 22 acres, a footprint that fluctuates entirely depending on recent rainfall, sprawling from the commercial storefronts at Redfish Village across the highway to the beach, while its smaller sibling is roughly half that size. Vacationers settle into yup-scale properties like the Sanctuary at Redfish, where a seasonal water taxi operates to ferry guests directly across the lake just to get to the sand. It is a highly appealing amenity, but it also functions as a charming daily admission of local aquatic authority, treating these lakes as a natural hourglass that flips every few months. Trading salt for fresh and solid beach for carved riverbed provides a useful mental model for operating here. A morning paddle on the calm inland water, followed by a bike ride along the coast, and ending with sunset where the dark lake bleeds into the Emerald Gulf, feels comprehensively planned. It is an experience you simply will not find on a standard beach trip, serving notice that the serene surface often conceals a much deeper mechanical reality. But as you watch the tea-colored water mix heavily with the sea, is the dark stain in the surf just decomposing leaf tannins, or is it a shadow moving against the current? High ground, blue blooms, storms and serenity on 30A. With the distinct possibility of an apex predator patrolling the tannin-dark surf, our family continued its impromptu audit of how quickly this placid coast can try to drown you. I combed the landscape for some sign of permanence. I wanted ground that stood defiantly above the fray. I scanned the pine forests, the swampy lake edges, and the shimmering beach, occasionally stepping on quartz sand that squeaked like a nervous mouse under my shoes. The only refuge I found was a local hill. Along this ruler-flat shore, a simple hill passes for a geological event of Himalayan proportions. This was Blue Mountain Beach, a community whose identity rests entirely on possessing the highest ground in the entire Gulf of Mexico, a staggering 65 feet of elevation. The name itself is a masterpiece of marketing perspective. Local legend claims that early sailors squinted at the shore at dawn. They reportedly saw a bluish haze blanketing the dunes from vast fields of flowering lupine. They then dubbed the sandy bump a mountain. It is an endearing story. One heavily suspects the sailors might have just been low on rum. Boaters actually used this lofty summit as a navigational landmark in previous centuries. That historical function speaks much less to the grandeur of the hill and far more to the profound flatness of everything else. Being the highest point on the Gulf Coast is exactly like being the tallest person in a kindergarten class. The distinction is technically accurate, but it feels slightly silly to bring up in conversation. This elevated terrain supports a surprisingly active ecosystem where the term wildlife encounter covers a spectrum ranging from the sublime to the annoyingly suburban. Swimmers might find themselves accidentally folded into a pod of hunting dolphins. You can hear the strange clicks and whistles of their echolocation vibrating through the water. A dorsal fin then slices the surface nearby. The experience feels less like a magical communion with nature and more like you have wandered into a private conversation you were not meant to hear. The terrestrial neighbors are decidedly less sublime. We were informed that the Florida black bear considers local garbage cans to be an unregulated buffet. These bears live in the adjacent Point Washington State Forest. This is not a majestic beast hunting in a primordial wilderness. This is a 400-pound cat burglar with a particular fondness for leftover grouper tacos. I began to view the nightly ritual of securing our trash bin not as a chore, but as a complex diplomatic offering to a furry nocturnal ambassador. Someone dropped a bin lid in the dark. The resulting distant clatter suggested that some vacationers were failing in their diplomatic duties. The bear would presumably leave those households a very poor review. We humans, meanwhile, stick to the aforementioned Timpucci Trail. We utilize the paved ribbon to tour the corridor at what is generously called a human pace. Hurricanes operate on an entirely different scale of time and consequence. Storms like Eloise in 1975, the previously discussed fury of Opal in 1995, and Ivan in 2004 regularly demonstrate that 65 feet of elevation is a mere suggestion to a Gulf storm surge. These cyclones clawed at the dunes, they tore apart the coastal roads, they reinforced the harsh lesson that the ocean always gets the final vote. It is the exact same raw power my family witnessed when Redfish Lake breached its banks, confirming that the dry land is just a temporary agreement between the water and the sand. The building codes that followed these tempests demand higher construction profiles and deeper property setbacks. These rules are not born of a random bureaucratic impulse. They constitute a direct, structural translation of the Gulf's established track record of periodic and violent rage. The true character of this coast is written not in the delicate blue lupine of mistaken maritime legend, but in the hard-won engineering required to survive atop this porous sand. Water's veins, aquifers' coastal cadence. Yet even that coastal engineering rests on a fragile, hidden foundation. Lingering on the fact that Blue Mountain Beach sits 65 feet above sea level had left me with a nagging sense of superficiality. Admiring a sand dune is like complimenting a giant on his haircut. You willfully ignore the far more interesting architecture holding the whole thing together. To understand the Panhandle's actual mechanics, we had to abandon the manicured resort corridor and drive inland to see the machinery under the hood. The road toward Defuniak Springs winds north into the Floridian Highlands, a geographic designation applied generously to any local terrain that does not immediately flood. This is a region defined by ridges and creeks fed by subterranean pressures rather than just rainfall. The town itself surrounds Lake Defuniak. The water is so perfectly round it looks like the earth opened a single, unblinking eye. 19th-century observers described it as a big, round spring boiling up on the top of this high plateau. It does not actually boil, which is fortunate for the local fish, but a quiet, relentless upwelling from the planet's core is clearly at work. A little farther on, the state's secret plumbing is entirely exposed at Ponce de Leon Spring. The site acts as a release valve for the great Floridan aquifer. Limpid water rushes from beneath layers of limestone, perfectly transparent and perpetually 68 degrees. That temperature delivers a sharp physical shock to a nervous system acclimated to Florida's soupy summer air. Where the spring run meets Sandy Creek, two distinct aquatic worlds collide. The crystalline water forms a vivid boundary against the dark, tannic creek. It is a meeting of liquids as fundamentally opposed as gin and black coffee. One side pure filtered groundwater, and the other a slow brew of leaves and swampy earth. Wading into that cold spring is an act of minor time travel. The water chilling your feet did not fall during last Tuesday's thunderstorm. It is rain that dropped onto the sandy hills of southern Alabama and northern Holmes County roughly 20 to 30 years ago. It spent decades on a patient descent, seeping through porous bedrock that acts as both a filter and an underground conduit. I was swimming in precipitation that fell when a pager was still a high-end status symbol. A single particle here has already been an Alabama raindrop, a subterranean seep, pressurized groundwater, and an artesian spring. It will eventually join a river and might go on to become part of a water moccasin or a Gulf billfish. Right now it was freezing the shins of a tourist, an outcome some purists likely view as a waste of a good geological journey. This spectacle relies entirely on the Floridan aquifer, a shared reservoir spanning 100,000 square miles beneath Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. It is less a conventional tank and more a colossal, waterlogged limestone sponge filled with cracks and massive underwater caves. Water enters at high-elevation recharge zones in the north and forces its way out at lower points like Ponce de Leon Spring through the sheer brute force of gravity and pressure. The system is so vast and leaky that it produces invisible rivers. Researchers who injected dye into the aquifer far inland were astonished to find it appearing in submarine springs miles out in the Gulf of Mexico, proving the continent is quite literally bleeding fresh water into the sea. Sharing a resource of this scale works smoothly until someone alters the flow. In the 1950s, the city of Savannah, Georgia, began pulling enormous quantities of water from the northern end of the aquifer. This rapid extraction created a regional cone of depression. The resulting dip in underground pressure was large enough that salt water crept into the municipal wells of Hilton Head, South Carolina. It was the geological equivalent of a neighbor draining the community pool from their own backyard. The subterranean gurgle at the spring is a quiet reminder that every community down here drinks from the exact same ancient system. That reliable, permanent pulse of pure water is what originally anchored life along this shifting coast, sustaining a continuous human presence long before any European surveyor mapped the beach. Echoes in the sand, chiefdoms to coexistence. That continuous human presence left its own sedimentary layers. The history of 30A is written not just in clear spring water and powdered Appalachian quartz, but in the packed earth and shattered ceramics of its first permanent residents. Long before this coastline turned into a solid wall of pastel rental properties, it was a living, working shoreline for Paleo-Indian hunters, archaic shellfishers, and a confusing succession of mound-building societies that modern archaeologists have to sort out like gossip columnists tracking a generational celebrity feud. The earliest human camps here are now entirely underwater, drowned by the rising Gulf of Mexico that followed the last ice age. Back then, the coastline sat so far seaward of modern 30A that today's beachfront property lines would have overlooked a broad, woody river valley. The region's original inhabitants were forced to retreat inland, their settlements swallowed by the water in a slow-motion eviction notice spanning millennia. What they left behind were the middens. These sophisticated, multi-generational trash heaps of oyster and clam shells record a population adapting to a physically unstable world. At one site near Choctawhatchee Bay, archaeologists found that a late archaic shell mound, essentially a 5,000-year-old landfill, was later promoted, receiving a second life as a ceremonial platform for an entirely different culture. One society's garbage, it seems, eventually becomes another's sacred architecture. By roughly 300 CE, the regional real estate started getting highly organized. The Weeden Island culture emerged, and with it came the first structural mounds. These were not the giant flat-topped pyramids appearing in standard textbook illustrations. They were small, conical burial mounds reserved strictly for the elite, drawing a sharp physical line between daily chores and the great beyond. Burials were accompanied by elaborate animal effigy pots and specialized ceramics so fragile they were never actually used by the living. This was the ancient equivalent of being buried with the good china you ordered everyone else not to touch, a clear sign that the desire to impress houseguests, even posthumously, is a deeply human trait. These communities were building the foundations of a complex society, dabbling in early agriculture while still utilizing a broad menu of hunted and gathered wild species. Then around 1200 CE, the regional dynamics shifted into a contested borderland between two major-league mound-building chiefdoms, the Fort Walton culture and the Pensacola culture. To an uncredentialed observer, telling them apart is an exercise in archaeological hair-splitting. They function roughly like rival store-brand colas. They look the same, they taste similar, and they occupy the exact same aisle, yet they are technically distinct products. The primary structural difference lay in their pottery recipes. Fort Walton communities, operating mostly as inland farmers, used sand and grit to temper their clay. The coastal Pensacola people, who focused heavily on maritime resources, used crushed shell. This minor manufacturing divergence is exactly how researchers now trace the territorial influence of these groups, whose borders overlapped right here on the 30A corridor. This cultural intersection created some lingering historical oddities. The most famous local landmark is the massive Fort Walton Mound just west of 30A. It is the specific site that gave the Fort Walton culture its modern name, yet current excavation data suggests it was almost certainly built and occupied by their Pensacola rivals. Identifying a landmark after the wrong historical civilization is a taxonomic mix-up, roughly on par with naming a library after a famous illiterate. This mound required a staggering construction effort of an estimated 200,000 basket loads of earth, functioning as a major administrative hub. The 30A strip itself acted as the sandy buffer zone, a frontier where residents likely maintained a mixed economy of Fort Walton corn and Pensacola oysters, creating a robust, if culturally confusing, place to call home. By the time Columbus was sorting out his navigation charts in the late 15th century, the great mound centers were already quiet. The political capitals at Lake Jackson and Fort Walton were largely abandoned by 1500. This decline was not triggered by European diseases, which had not yet arrived, but plausibly by internal politics, shifting trade economics, and prolonged environmental stress. The great chiefdoms did not collapse in a sudden cinematic storm of warfare. They mostly just fizzled out. Their people dispersed and reorganized over generations. The Fort Walton culture did not simply vanish, but slowly evolved into the communities the Spanish would later encounter and label as the Appalachian. The overarching archaeological story is one of transformation rather than disappearance. Standing on the modern beach, looking back at a dense wall of resorts, I felt an unexpected kinship with the project managers of the Pensacola culture and their 200,000 basket-load pyramid of dirt. I, too, had been put in charge of a massive logistical undertaking requiring careful coordination and immense collective labor. I, too, knew the unique, terrifying pressure of rallying a stubborn community toward a singular, monumental goal. It was my year to organize the family Thanksgiving lunch. What stays with you after a chapter like this isn't the resort architecture or even the drama of a floodgate tearing open mid-walk, but the quieter realization that the same forces shaping those dunes and coastal lakes, water finding its own level, shorelines refusing to hold still, also shaped every human story laid on top of them. Conflict, reinvention, and movement aren't imported themes here. They're practically part of the local geology. Seaside looks like a movie set partly because it was one, but the deeper irony is that the whole corridor has always been a kind of stage where people arrived with firm plans and the land rewrote them. Next chapter, those rewrites get started early, with a pilot named Miruelo, whose faulty memory of a bay he once entered helped send an entire expedition toward catastrophe, and a mapping voyage that tried to replace guesswork with hard coastlines, only for the coast to keep winning anyway. If this journey is pulling you in, the full travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conquistadors, and Condos. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community over on Patreon.